Our plan to collect questions from the audience worked.
Careful what you wish for.
I have received over the course of the evening 47 cue cards, some with more than one question. So you can imagine it's going to be a difficult thing to try to synthesize those questions, and I've tried to do that in a way that I think reflects things that haven't been addressed. Some questions focused on issues that I think have been successfully, I hope, addressed already during the course of the evening. They fall into a few categories, and I'm going to take the liberty that comes with being the moderator to try to synthesize these, and I'm going to open them up to the panel for discussion. First question, what kind of change do we need to have in society so that people will not need to ask these kinds of questions anonymously? I'll open up to the panel.
Oops. I was just going to say events like this and just creating conversations. Every small effort that we make can make a difference.
And I think I would say for most things in life, that very first step's the hardest. And I think we have to have the actual courage to take that first step. And I think you described it so well that when you shared what you were dealing with your friends, to your surprise, they really embraced you. And I think, again, that first step is we have to just be able to take that very first step.
I think just as I said earlier, imitation can cause contagion of suicidality. The flip side is that because teenagers are so influenced by the media and they look up to movie stars and rock stars, that when famous people come out as having mental illness, that has a huge positive impact on kids. So, when I go into a school and I'm trying to talk about stigma, if I list off the number of famous people who've had mental illness, the kids are going, what? Well, I didn't know that. And like what you were saying about the football player, who came out about having mental illness. Apparently there's a video circulating today of some NFL NFL players, they're like movie stars, who are braiding the hair of their daughters to show that men and fathers can have a tender, nurturing, soft side. And apparently the video has gone viral. So I think similarly, if particularly men can show that it's okay to be fallible, it's okay to be, have not be perfect, that could have a huge impact.
A friend of mine, Orlando Da Silva, is a former president of Ontario Bar Association. And under his leadership as president, he committed that organization to focus on mental health in lawyers, who are surprisingly a high-risk population. When he went public with his own story of depression, a serious suicide attempt from which he was saved really just by good fortune, ECT, and a positive response. And he told his colleagues, I have to tell my story. The initial response he received from his colleagues were, you will never be able to work again if you do this. You gotta keep this quiet. He had the courage to override their concern. And as a result, I think has done some magnificent things for lawyers, for the profession. And he has been inundated with emails and phone calls over the course of the last year and a half. Literally hundreds of lawyers reaching out to him for help. So how do we create an environment where people aren't afraid to ask the questions directly? And I'm not saying that in fact is true for everyone in this room, but I think the way that we do that is by showing courage in speaking about the reality of what people are dealing with. Again, going back to my comments about cancer. Cancer was in the shadows 40 years ago. It is no longer in the shadows. HIV was in the shadows 25 years ago. It is no longer in the shadows. All of these issues have to come forward, and they come forward through people's courage. Danielle, I think, is an exemplar of that. So hopefully we will continue to grow from strength to strength on that front and demonstrate courage. The next set of questions focus on access to resources. Again, I'm going to synthesize many questions. Why is it so hard to see a psychiatrist? Why do we not have access to psychotherapy that's funded by OHIP? Is there residential care available for adolescents and young adults in this province, or do we all have to go to the States if that's something that is required? I'll open that up to the panel.
What was the first one?
Access to psychiatrists, access to psychotherapy, access to more intensive residential treatments.
I mean, I think some of the challenges around access to psychiatry relate to the fact that there isn't a great organizing system for access to a lot of specialists. So we don't really know very much about how psychiatrists are working. We know there probably aren't enough of them, but we also probably don't, as a city, as a province, have a kind of organizing system to make sure that we're doing good triage of both younger and older patients. We don't have a great organizing structure to make sure that every family doctor knows how they would be able to access psychiatrists on patients' behalf. So part of it relates to we have kind of a non-system system where there's probably unequal knowledge and unequal access that we all need to kind of advocate to change. Because at the moment, we're all working, all of us and all of you, we're all paying tax, we're all looking for getting kind of good health care for our working dollars and for the sort of right to access. But I think right now, we don't have enough of an organized system to make sure that it's equitable for people. And I think as it relates to psychotherapy, so long as there's limited access, there's going to be a challenge around how much access to a psychiatrist is about a consultation and treatment, and how much is about a consultation only and then treatment by someone else. And so part of it, I think, relates to really making sure that we kind of advocate to government for having a system where every family doctor knows that they can make a referral and get access not just to a consultation, but also to treatment going forward.
Just in terms of the numbers, why is it hard to find a child psychiatrist? In all of Canada, there are 500 child psychiatrists. So in Ontario, which has about a third of the population of the country, there's about 175 child psychiatrists for the whole province of Ontario. Furthermore, in terms of how many young people we're training and graduating, so the University of Toronto, which is the largest university in the country, has 4 spots for child psychiatrists every year. 4. And that's the largest in the country. And it's not for lack of interest in child psychiatry. Geriatric and forensic and child, we've just been approved recently as subspecialties by the national accreditation body. So between forensic and geriatric and child, there are 12 spots in the University of Toronto. And these spots are oversubscribed. So again, it's not for lack of interest. So, I would encourage all of you to speak to your MPP, because this is a provincial funding of universities and colleges, fund more training spots so that we can graduate more child geriatric and forensic psychiatrists, because there's a huge need. That having been said, I completely agree with Leslie about we have a non-system, it's fragmented. A lot of counseling services, which are free, are offered through the Ministry of Children and Youth. That's a different ministry than the Ministry of Health. Do you think the ministries talk to each other? Not a chance. It is real left-hand, right-hand stuff. So the step down from the acute units to community-based care is terrible. It just doesn't happen. There's fragmentation. And again, we need more interministerial. The different parts of government have to talk to each other, coordinate.
I think these are all important points. I think that Jonathan, in your presentation, you I think highlighted the breadth of services that Jewish Family and Child Service provides. So I have 2 responses to that question. One is think about the whole range of providers. Jewish Family and Child Service is an outstanding agency. You will see outside other sources of support and treatment that you might not have thought about. JAX is an outstanding agency focusing on addiction within the Jewish community. So I'm going to encourage people to think broadly when we look at issues of access, and I'm going to encourage people, as Marshall has said, to think about advocacy. If you had a family member who had breast cancer and you were told, sorry, we can't get you to see an oncologist, we can't get you to get radiation therapy, we have to send you to Buffalo for radiation therapy, knowing that you have a narrow window where the prognosis is better if you get treatment, and if you miss that window, the prognosis worsens. What would you do? You would fight like hell to get that care. And I'm going to encourage you to take that fight to your MPPs, and both at the provincial level and at the federal government level. The next question. How do we create healthier school environments, healthier work environments, and healthier children? Small question.
So, you know, schools are a perfect entry point into the system. You know, Mullen talked about upstream, midstream, downstream. I mean, that's what we're talking now is primary prevention. So, what's the culture of our schools? I think we have to work harder at creating, as I mentioned in my talk, a tolerance of diversity. The whole bullying thing. Kids can be cruel. Kids can be mean to each other. Whether it's because you're too tall, or you're too short, or you're too skinny, or you're too fat, or you have mental illness, or you're black, or you're white. I mean, there's so many differences, and yet, you know, that's what makes society so vibrant and wonderful. So I think in our schools we need to do a better job of creating cultures that are tolerant of diversity and difference. But we also have to do a better job of supporting our teachers. You know, cutbacks in special ed have had their downstream effects in terms of teachers having, if not larger classes, more kids with serious socio-emotional problems in their classes. And so we need to do a better job of supporting our teachers.
And I think that the fact that there are so many people here this evening, for me it kind of brings it back to what is our responsibility at our own dinner tables? Are we able to be together as a family? Are we able to actually model, if there are mental health issues, if I've had a hard day, to actually, our kids are very small sponges and they become bigger sponges, and we have them with us for a short window, and as parents we can influence their trajectory in so many ways. So if we as parents can model it's okay to talk about these things, and they see that it's okay. I mean, I'm amazed, my children, the things that they're able to talk about with their peers are things that I never felt comfortable talking about. We've made some inroads in breaking that stigma. The fact that you're here is a wonderful step forward, and we need to keep and actually model that type of behavior in front of our children.
I think also in the workplace we really have to kind of walk the walk and talk the talk, because I think so often in workplaces, you know, people are relatively generous in making accommodations when someone has carpal tunnel and they can't type so well, or they have some other kind of more kind of obvious physical disability or some kind of time-limited illness, and yet when someone turns and asks for accommodation for depression where they have a little bit less work or less stress or less strain, they're often facing an environment that's much, much less tolerant and much less accommodating. And I think, you know, we all have moments where we're human, when we might be frustrated if someone can't do work as quickly or they need a certain accommodation, but I think we really have to walk the walk if we want people to have, you know, productive work, even though they have depression or anxiety. We have to be willing to kind of create work situations where someone can be productive and feel productive and still manage their anxiety, and I think that we really have to hold ourselves accountable to that.
And just to add on to workplace environments, I think it's also important if you're an employer to show your employees that it's okay to get support and make sure that they're able to access mental wellness days, just like you would have a sick day, that if you're struggling with your mental health, it's okay to not come into work that day, and creates breaking the stigma events at work or raising awareness is really key in that as well.
In terms of workplace, with all due respect to the insurance agents in the audience, have a bit of a bone to pick with the insurance industry, because mental illness is an exclusion from so many insurance policies, and people are very frightened of putting down mental illness on any kind of insurance, and with good reason. I mean, the CDC did an expose of insurance policies a couple of weeks ago, and it turns out that CAMH has one of the most restrictive, intolerant insurance policies for their own staff. So.
We'll do two more questions. This next one I know is a challenge. And a number of people submitted questions related to this, whether it was related to a child or a parent. How do you manage to get someone into care when they refuse to participate in treatment?
I know when I was working at Child and Adolescent Services, a lot of children or adolescents didn't want to come in because they thought their parents were going to know everything they talked about, or were just kind of scared of what the whole experience was. So to explain how you don't have to be in the room with them, and how it's really for them to have someone that can keep their secret with them, and to just really explain what the whole experience is about, and being compassionate, finding out why they don't want to receive the help, and being really understanding of that, because they could be really scared like I was.
So I agree with that. I think the other thing to kind of know, which is maybe talking about more of the acute side of the spectrum, I think what a lot of people may not think of or even know about, if you're really worried about someone young, old, or in between who may be depressed, who may be unsafe, either because they're not looking after themselves very well or they're having suicidal thoughts, that's a reason to come to an emergency department or call 911 just like any other emergency. And although I don't think any of us would wish for that to be the first entry point for someone with a mental health disorder, sometimes it's a necessary first entry point if other steps that you've tried to take along the spectrum of family doctor, counseling, other kinds of organizations. Because I think often families, again, it relates to the stigma, don't think of those as kind of emergencies the same way as we think of physical emergencies, and people are suffering in rooms they haven't left in decades, or basements they haven't come up from for years. And so you can call 911, and you can also call the police line for a mental health crisis team to come to your home and give you support and answer your questions. And so it's not the first step, or necessarily even the kind of most comfortable step, but it's usually a critical change for patients and families if they can finally get to the front door where they can get some help.
There are certain kinds of psychotherapies or psychotherapeutic approaches for patients who have poor insight into their illness. Common examples would be eating disorders, substance abuse, the beginning of psychosis like schizophrenia. The person lacks insight. So there are certain psychotherapies, motivational interviewing, dialectical behavior therapy, where there are strategies that can be used to try and basically you go over the pros and the cons of what their current state of being is. But what I also say is, sometimes you can't go in through the front door, so you go in through the side door. And what I mean by that is you engage the family. And if the patient, him or herself, won't come in initially, then you have to start with the parents or the siblings or the spouse. And if you counsel them first about how to live with the person, but also how to persuade the person that it's not going to be as scary as they think, then you go with who the motivated person is. So I call that going through the side door. So you don't always necessarily start with the identified patient. You sometimes start with the family, and then you have the family kind of persuade the person. Last resort or worst case scenario, as Leslie was alluding to, is sometimes people have to be brought into treatment, or at least for assessment, against their will. So our laws do permit involuntary assessment, and there's also something called a Form 2, where we go to a justice of the peace. So there are legal mechanisms in place for getting a person who's truly a danger to themselves or others, but they lack the insight. There are mechanisms for bringing them in against their will, but of course you want to try and avoid that if you can.
I'm sorry we're not going to get to all of the questions. I mentioned earlier that I hope this will be the first event and not the only event. And I'm going to conclude with asking the panel one last question, and that is, what should someone say to comfort someone who has lost someone to suicide?
I would probably defer to the rabbis on that one.
I mean, I don't mean it simply, but I think probably the first thing I would say is what I would say to anyone who's had a loss, which is to say, I'm so sorry for the loss, and to acknowledge it the same way as we would acknowledge the loss of life through any other kind of way, because I think that's probably the first way to make sure that the grief is still grief, is still grief. And I would wait to hear more to see what else I could say about the way that that loss occurred.
And I think just to kind of pick up on your point, the fact that you would respond in the same way as kind of any other, kind of passing is such an important message that if we respond differently, it means that there's something different, there's some shame, so the fact that the responses should be that sameness as far as I'm so sorry for your loss, whether it's a suicide or any other a specific tragic loss, I think that in itself can tell an important message.
Yeah, just to add, I fully agree with that. And I think there's so many of us that are scared of the word suicide. And I think we focus too much on how the person died instead of just recognizing that the person's grieving the loss of someone and just needs someone to be there to support them and not judging what happened, rather just wanting to be a support.
Yeah, I think I would say, is there anything I can do to help? How are you doing with this? And is there anything I can do to help? That's a non-judgmental, validating kind of response.
The whole thrust of our evening tonight has been to open up a dialogue and discussion, to improve people's knowledge and awareness and make it possible to have difficult conversations perhaps a little bit more easily. One of the axioms I learned early in my training was that shame grows in the dark. And if you shed light on shame, it diminishes. I think that's relevant to the last question that we just were addressing. I think it's relevant to everything we've talked about tonight. I am very pleased and proud that this community has undertaken to do this in this way. We're going to conclude with a thank you to all of the organizers and all of the presenters. Thank you.